Hello class, welcome to class 2 and as promised this is going to be an online session and if as you saw the readings we have two key readings for this class. I'll just pull up the syllabus for you guys. So here we have Calhoun about the reading about civil society and the public sphere, and Keck and Sikkinck who talk about activists beyond borders, advocacy network in international politics. And I will also send you some media articles about the case study that we're examining today, which is about Turkey and the international networks that proliferate within Turkey and those that are advocating for democracy. Given the particular situation that Turkey is facing today, with the rollback of democracy and increased power for the president Erdogan. So, having said that, let's move on to the learning outcomes. So, at the end of today's sessions, hopefully you will be able to analyze and answer some of the substantive questions which are part of the second unit of this class. So the first thing that I would really like you to understand and substantively being able to engage is the idea of what is an activist NGO, what sorts of networks do they bring to the table, and whether all of these NGOs are good, whether is it possible that some of these NGOs are doing work which is harmful, especially if one considers the role of state sovereignty, because that really is the basis of most of the discourses of democracy and you might even call governance issues across the world, and how that meets specifically discourses of international organizations, international governance is a fascinating one. And I think especially given the change in the norms of governance, the change in understanding of what a democracy is, I think Turkey is an interesting case to examine. Some of the broad discussions that I'd like you to focus on today, and hopefully you will participate in the discussions that I've created online, are involving civil society and how have NGOs participated in this framework, and when does this notion of civil society become popular around the world? What are the factors that gave rise to it? And are there other alternative frameworks to understand civil society? I mean, to understand NGO action, is civil society the only one that we need to we can use to understand how international NGOs function? So, with this out of the way, let's try to focus a little bit on some of the framing questions. Like, for instance, how does the notion of pluralism in American society, how does that play into how we understand the role of NGOs, both domestic and international? And especially for those of you who have read Federalist 10, where James Madison talks about the groups, various groups that are existing within a society, and the role that each one plays, and what might that entail? How might the tyranny of the majority control those that are in the minority? I think this is a very important question. Whether we live in the US or whether we live in less free societies such as Turkey, China, or other Middle East countries that are undergoing huge transformations. So these questions become very important for us to ponder, and I'd like you to keep this in mind as we move forward with this class. Having shared that with you, I want you to focus a little bit on the readings. Let's spend a little bit of time on the readings themselves. And I just have jotted down a few key ideas and few concepts from both the readings, and I'll focus on them. And of course, you're welcome to bring up other ideas or arguments that I may not have covered. But in Calhoun, one of the first things that one of the first and the most important things is the notion of the public sphere, which where Calhoun uses the notion of public sphere that Habermas is really credited as making very popular and in fact, his Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere is a very important read in case you have not studied it. Now, in this framework, there are a few things that one needs to know to begin to understand what is the public sphere. So, public sphere, as we understand in the West, is any open space where debate, argumentation, and exchange of ideas can happen. So, in very simple terms. So, I'm simplifying this whole concept. So, a civil society or a free civil society is one where there's maximum participation. So participation in terms of engaging in deliberation, engaging in debate, engaging in various forms of political or social activity is a free society according to Habermas. Now, how does this freedom come about is a completely it's a related but a completely different idea. So people, Calhoun points out that market-led thinkers like Adam, uh, Ferguson and Adam Smith, they point to the notion that the market is really the driving force, that free markets and individual liberty and these notions which we popularly known as libertarianism, so these really drive the notion of free civil society. Whereas there are others who, sociologists in particular, they really focus on social relations, they focus on class relations, and the state, of course, going beyond just a purely economic understanding of our society. And Calhoun points out here that one of the problems with Habermas's framing here is that there are structural inequalities in our society. I mean, almost every society, and unfortunately, in the U.S., it's probably at the highest in a developed country. And he says that the assumption that structural inequalities are primarily economic is wrong. So he uses an example of gender inequalities, for instance, or identity inequalities as inequalities in terms of how they are treated or how they are perceived in the public sphere, as another example which Habermas does not really cover. And the second problem here is that Habermas assumes that identity is formed in a private sphere, in the security of one's home, in one's school, or in any sort of private setting. Now, this assumption also is bound to be questioned, simply because in today's world we are seeing that identity is becoming a very publicly contested idea, and battles are being fought over issues about migration, human rights, women's rights, environment, you name it. So this is an ongoing challenge that we are seeing. And also, Habermas assumes that there is this notion of nationalism or identity politics as being problematic. Now, that itself is again bound to be questioned, because nationalism has some positive aspects in terms of binding people and bringing them together, but how that meets global notions of globalization and intergovernmental exchanges is something that is not really covered in Habermas's framing. Now let's move on to Keck and Sikkinck, who basically give us a fairly good understanding of how transnational networks function, how they are formed, what is their modus operandi, if you will, and where are they coming from, so to say. Now, excuse me for that. Now, it's a fascinating read again. Now, they really offer a good framing of how NGOs pressure their own domestic governments as well as international governments, and sometimes use their state to pressure other states using the networks, using exchanges of, it could be knowledge, it could be social capital, it could be money in many cases, to influence one another. And in fact, I want to point to a resource which is in Washington, D.C., called the International Network for Civil Society. Now, I will send you the link to that organization, and they estimate that there are over 1,850 NGOs purely focusing on humanitarian issues, working globally based in the US. Now, that's just an anecdote which I wanted to share with you in terms of the number of international organizations working purely in humanitarian issues. Now, there are various other issues which are not covered here, right? So, some interesting points here, which I'm sure you've noticed and you've analyzed and thought through as you were reading this article. Now, one of the key points which he mentioned and which I tried to elaborate a little earlier is the whole boomerang pattern, which I mentioned, where state NGOs, as you can see in this diagram, they pressure their state in many cases through the use of information to pressure another state which might have a bigger stake or more influence in this case to pressure the other state to act in a certain way or to release certain information or to give out more freedoms to certain people or release certain prisoners, for instance. So as you're thinking of this, I want you to pay a little attention to the challenges of information flow, especially when it comes to issues of nationalism, as we are seeing today, and how that is impacting the work of international NGOs themselves. And I'd love for you to bring in examples where you think it's important and relevant for us to see how these information flows are being targeted. I want to wrap up today's lecture session, by sharing the example of Turkey. Now, for those of you who do not know, Turkey has been going a rapid shift towards authoritarianism, as many would argue, with the consolidation of power by the President Erdogan, especially in the context of the July 15, 2016 attempted coup, which he blamed on the Gulen movement activists. And so that's sort of an ongoing discussion whether they did it or not. There's a lot of controversy around that. And as of now, with the Western powers, US, EU, others, have not accepted this argument fully. And so that's still ongoing. In the meanwhile, in April of this year, there was a referendum which expanded the power of the president and said that he can rule until 2029. So the question that a lot of Turkey observers are asking is this a return to the Ottoman era of the Ottoman Empire? And will Turkey stop being a republic, a constitutional republic as it is today? And also there are fears, and of course there's a purge going on with hundreds and thousands of people being laid off, with political prisoners, and also a witch hunt going on around the world from the perspective of those who are impacted. Now, the state has its own reasons to act in a certain way, but if one analyzes how civil society is being impacted, how these NGOs, individuals even, are being impacted, I think this is a grave danger to Turkish democracy. Now, I'll leave you with these thoughts and hope to see your responses on the discussion board, and also seeing you the coming Tuesday. Thank you.